Section 6.4 is on equations with radicals. For this section, some of the problems are longer than others, and so we have to be careful with our algebra, and we always have to make sure that we write out all of our steps. Let's take a look at some steps to solve. The equations in this section will contain at least one radical. The first thing that we want to do is we'd like to isolate one of the radicals on one side of the equation. So for this example, we already have the radical isolated. So we just go to step 2. Raise both sides to the power of the index. What we want to do is, in order to solve this equation, I have to eliminate the radical. We can't isolate x if it's inside of a radical. So the index for this radical is 2. What happens if I raise both sides to the second power? If you square a square root, the radical just goes away and we're left with x times x minus 5. The third step is more of a question. Do you have to FOIL? For some of the more complicated problems, we will have to FOIL, and I'll show you once we get to that step. Repeat steps 1 through 3 if your equation still contains a radical, which we don't have to do 3 or 4 because our equation doesn't have a radical anymore. Step 5, solve and check your answer. Not all of the solutions that you get will work, and so that's why we need to that's why we need to check. So what we're going to do here is distribute. Since this is a quadratic equation, we need to get a 0 on one side and we need to factor. Subtract 36. So what we're going to do right now is just factor. (9 minus 9 and plus 4). Set each factor equal to 0. We get 2 solutions. Before I box these, we need to check to make sure that they work. So this is how you check. Okay, this is very important. Once you get your answer, when you check your answer, you need to go back to the original problem, which is the one that's given. We don't want to check our answers down here because they might work here and not in the original problem. So anytime we square both sides of an equation, it does introduce error, and so that's why some of these answers that you get might not work. So let's check with the original equation. Okay, so all you do is you take your answer and substitute it back. Is that going to be equal to 6? 9 minus 5 is 4. 9 times 4 is 36. Square root of 36 is 6. So 6 is equal to 6. As long as the left and right sides are equal, the solution works. I can box this. Let's try -4. is that equal to 6? Negative 4 minus 5 is negative 9. Negative 9 times negative 4 is positive 36, and this also works. So both of these work, so we could box both of them. Sometimes when you get two answers, only one works or none works. Okay, so be careful when you're doing these. Let's take a look at example 2. So for this example, notice again, the first step is to isolate the radical. Since this radical is not isolated, I have to add 13, and also we need to subtract 5x. Or you can also just subtract this radical and move it to the other side. Let's do that. I think it's simpler. So just subtract this square root for both sides. The index is 2, so raise both sides to the power of the index. Looks like this. Step 3, do you need to FOIL? Let's look at what we have. This is a binomial. If you have a binomial squared, you have to FOIL. So we do need to FOIL here. You can write that twice if you want, because that's essentially how we're going to FOIL. If I square a negative, that becomes positive. You square a square root, that just gives me x plus 7. Okay, so we are going to FOIL what we have here. So let's go ahead and do that. Combine your like terms. Also, this is a quadratic equation. And so to solve, you need to get 0 on one side and we need to factor. So let's combine our like terms, subtract x, and also subtract 7. So after doing all that, this is what we should get. Okay, so the numbers are pretty large here, but we can still factor this. So there's no greatest common factor, and the way we're going to factor is we need to look at factors of 25 and factors of 162. The signs should both be negative, and if you do this correctly, okay, so you do need to think about this, but if you factor this correctly, this is what we get. And we set each factor equal to 0. And we solve, add 81, divide by 25, we get 81 over 25. Okay. So now, remember, you have to go back and check your work. What we're going to do again is take 2 and substitute it, go back to the original equation, plug in 2 here and here, and then we want to make sure and check to see that we get 0 equal to 0. And then you're going to do the same thing for 81 over 25. This might be a little bit more work because it is a fraction, but you can still check it. So after you check The only answer that works actually in this case is x equal to 2. The second answer, when you check, it does not work. Let's take a look at a third example. So this is an example where we have two radicals. Since one of them is isolated, I can just directly square both sides. Step 3 is ask yourself, do I have to FOIL? Yes, in this case you do, because on the right side, this is considered to be a binomial. You've got part 1 plus part 2, so 2 terms. This part has to be FOILed. We write it twice. We FOIL. Square root of x plus 6 times square root of x plus 6 is just going to be x plus 6 once you simplify the square root. Combine like terms. Since we still have a square root, okay, the whole purpose of squaring is to get rid of all the square roots. We only got rid of one of them. I still need to get rid of this second square root, and so we have to go through steps 1 through 3 one more time. Subtract x from both sides and subtract 7. Once you subtract x, x goes away, and subtract 7, this is what we're left with. Divide by 2, both sides. Okay, let's look at what we have carefully. This says that square root is equal to a negative number. By definition, square root is always greater than or equal to 0. So this is not possible. This is actually a no solution. And you can see that if you don't notice it here, we would square both sides, and when you square both sides, you get that x is equal to 3. When you check 3 into the original problem, you'll see that it doesn't work.